Genie Oil Investigation Part 9. So I discussed previously how the Western oil cartel used the American CIA and the Israeli Mossad to recruit, arm, train, and coordinate various military bosses in Sudan to repeatedly overthrow the Sudanese government between the 50s up to the 1990s. And in the process, they started two brutal civil wars. Well, during the 1980s, the Soviets were bleeding out in Afghanistan as the CIA fought against them using Afghan and Arab Muslims as proxies. The official story is that on Christmas Eve in '79, the Soviet Union launched this unprovoked attack and invasion on its southern neighbor of Afghanistan, and that the USA only got involved as a result of this Soviet aggression. Well, folks, that's just not true. The truth is that the CIA purposely provoked the Soviets into invading. They wanted to get the Soviets mired down in an unwinnable war that would drain the Soviet Union's economy and justify a massive response from the Arab world. Basically, the plan was to lure the Soviets in to justify a global jihad against them. And that's not my own theory. That's a fact, and I can prove it to you. Afghanistan sat on the border of the Soviet Union. And the year that I was born, 1973, an Afghan prince, Mohammed Daoud, took power in Afghanistan. Daoud was a pro-Soviet. The CIA didn't like that, so they started meddling in the internal affairs of the country. Although they had no business in that region of the world, the CIA began a program of funding Islamic radicalism, extremist activity, to try and undermine this pro-Soviet government. And one of the main figures they backed was a heroin trafficker named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. The CIA formed a business relationship with Hekmatyar and expanded the drug trade globally to raise money for its black ops, including funding the fundamentalist uprising against the Afghan government. So the CIA activity was done on behalf of the Zionist faction of the New World Order globalists. In the United States, a new political faction loyal to this Zionist agenda was forming, and the faction came to be known later on as the neocons or neoconservatives. The first major neocon was a conservative Democratic senator named Henry Jackson. People usually assume that neocons are all Republicans because we saw so many of them in the George W. Bush administration. But the truth is that there are as many neocon Democrats as Republicans. Hillary Clinton is a big-time neocon. And originally, the neocons of the 70s were almost exclusively Democrats. You may not have heard of Senator Henry Jackson, but you might have heard about his very outspoken pro-Israel aide named Richard Pearl. Pearl became heavily involved during the Reagan years as Assistant Secretary of the Defense, and he was the chairman of the Defense Policy Board during the George W. Bush administration. And so Pearl had a really big hand in getting us into this war with Iraq. Pearl is a notorious neocon Zionist. He was a member of several Zionist think tanks, including the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and he was also on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group for many years. So anyway, Pearl helped to radicalize this senator, Jackson, into a rabid pro-Israel Zionist. Even Henry Kissinger called Pearl a ruthless little bastard. So these neocon Zionists pushed like crazy to get President Ford to shift from the American policy of avoiding direct confrontation with the Soviets to this in-your-face kind of confrontational attitude. The Bilderbergers decided, though, that Ford just wasn't doing enough to help their cause, so they chose Jimmy Carter to replace Ford as president. And during the Carter years, the CIA just went wild in Afghanistan. They were funding radicalism, they were creating Islamic brigades to use against the pro-Soviet government, until that government was teetering on the edge of collapse. It was the intent of the CIA to trigger a civil war inside Afghanistan. That's what they were trying to do. So the only reason the Soviets entered Afghanistan was to try and prop up this government and keep it from collapsing. Just like the Russians today are doing in Syria to try to keep Bashar al-Assad's pro-Russian government from being collapsed by the CIA. It's the same thing. Even though it wasn't called Al-Qaeda yet, it was the United States that funded its creation in the 70s, Carter's national security advisor was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He gave an interview in 1998 in which he admits to all of this. He said that the official story that the USA just got involved in Afghanistan as a result of the Soviet entry, he said that's absolutely not true. He said he even wrote a letter to President Carter explaining that what the CIA was doing was creating instability with a radical Muslim terrorist network, and that was going to incite the Soviets to invade. So the guy conducting this interview with Brzezinski asked him if he felt regret over any of that. And Brzezinski responded that he had absolutely no regrets, that the creation of a Muslim jihadist network was an excellent idea. He said that stirring up Muslims was a fair price to pay to help collapse the Soviet Union. So once again, we've got evidence that the CIA created a network of Islamic fundamentalists who today everybody just calls them Al-Qaeda for convenience. And I'll talk more about Osama bin Laden's role in this network in our next video. Genie Oil Investigation Part 10. Someone pointed out in the comments section of my last video that I reported on Zbigniew Brzezinski 2 hours before his family publicly announced his death, and suggested that maybe I had some inside knowledge. I can honestly say that while I did know enough to understand that something was going on with Brzezinski, I didn't learn about his death until everyone else did. That's all I'm going to say about that. But I will say that Brzezinski had a role in creating what came to be known as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a misunderstood concept, though, but we're going to get into that in a different video. For this one, let's get back to Osama bin Laden. Several of you have asked me to talk a bit more about who he was before I go further into his backstory. So let me give you just a little bit of biographical information on him. His full name is Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden. It's a mouthful. The word bin means son of, just like the Hebrew word ben, yes. So Osama's full name means Osama, son of Muhammad, son of Awad, son of Laden. His father, Muhammad, was the son of Awad, who was his grandfather. And then it skips a generation and refers to Osama's great-great-grandfather, Laden. Bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia, but he was actually an ethnic Yemeni. He was a Kindite. The Kindites were an ancient Arabian kingdom. They started out as polytheistic. They converted to Judaism, and then in the 7th century, they converted to Islam. So Obama's father, Muhammad, he was from Yemen, and his mother was from Syria. Muhammad was a polygamist. He had 56 children by 22 wives, but the good thing was he never had more than 4 wives at a time. As the wives would start to age, he would divorce them and get new ones so he could continue having children. An interesting piece of trivia is that Muhammad was actually on his way to marry his 23rd wife when his plane crashed and killed him. And a strange coincidence, after Muhammad died, control of his company went to his oldest son, Salem, who was also killed. He was killed in 1988 near San Antonio, Texas, when his plane flew into power lines and crashed. Now that's a good conspiracy theory we can get into another time. Anyway, bin Laden was born March 10th of 1957. He was raised as a Sunni Muslim, but he attended a secular primary school. I think it was called Al-Fager, something like that. The school modeled itself after a British preparatory school, so they used the same dress code. So Osama would have worn a white Oxford shirt and a tie and gray trousers and black shoes. I kind of picture him dressed like the AC/DC guitarist Angus Young. Well, anyway, later on he studied economics and business administration in college, and he earned a degree in civil engineering. But he liked to study poetry. He loved things like Black Stallions. He even played center forward on the soccer team. Those who knew him said that he was a mild-mannered guy. He was soft-spoken, friendly to everyone. This isn't the kind of picture that most of us have in mind when we think of bin Laden. And reports of him being this towering 6'6" giant are greatly exaggerated. His closest friends said that he was just over 6 feet tall. He was skinny, weighed about 160 pounds. And in most pictures, you see him wearing a traditional Yemeni headdress instead of the Saudi style. It's called a keffiyeh. The Saudi one is like a scarf that drapes over the head with one of those hoops to hold it in place. But the Yemeni style wraps the scarf around the head into a kind of turban. It's not important, just something I thought was interesting. Osama himself married between 5 to 6 wives, and he fathered 20 to 26 children, somewhere in there. That's about all I can think of as far as the trivial stuff. I'll tell you just a little bit more, though, about how the CIA used Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. We'll get into that in the next video. Genie Oil Investigation Part 11. So we know that after his university studies, Osama traveled in 1979 to Pakistan to link up with the CIA's Mujahideen forces who were fighting in the neighboring Afghanistan. But despite all of the photos that get tossed around showing bin Laden, firing Kalashnikov or whatever it is, he wasn't in what you would call the infantry. He didn't personally go out and fight in battles. Remember, this is the guy who liked poetry and horses. His role was being a money man. You may remember that I mentioned in a previous video that the CIA was funneling money to the Pakistani intelligence service. Well, bin Laden acted as the bagman. He controlled the slush fund called the MAK. And through that fund, the CIA was laundering money to the Arab terrorist network that it was building. Bin Laden also brought in tons of his family's construction equipment and built the extensive underground facilities and coast. The way that Western media portrays bin Laden is way off from the truth. They make it sound like he was out there in Afghanistan recruiting terrorists and organizing them into fighting units like some kind of general and sending them out with his guerrilla warfare training to complete deadly missions. Bin Laden had almost nothing to do with any of that. He's pretty much a cross between a glorified accountant and a construction manager for the CIA in Afghanistan. The CIA needed an insider, somebody with the skills of a businessman, somebody with extensive networking connections. Remember, bin Laden's family was intimately connected with the Saudi government. Bin Laden is a lot like George Soros. He threw money around to groups whose goals overlapped the goals of the CIA and the Mossad. Think about what the CIA has been doing, for example, in the last several years in Syria. It's funneling money to these rebel groups, these fighters who want to overthrow the government. There are tons of different factions fighting in Syria, dozens of them. Sometimes they work together, but just as often they're fighting each other. The CIA has all kinds of rat lines that funnel arms and money to these groups. Somebody's got to be the money guy in Syria right now. I don't know who it is yet, but I guarantee you the CIA has a handful of new people doing the exact same thing in Syria today that they had bin Laden doing in Afghanistan. Bin Laden wasn't creating dastardly plots while sitting on some throne at the top of a terrorist power structure, sending out his minions to do his bidding. The CIA was behind the orchestration of those operations. It wasn't bin Laden. For example, someone else that the CIA was making use of in Afghanistan was the founder of a fundamentalist group called Egyptian Islamic Jihad. That guy's name was Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the CIA used Zawahiri and his group to carry out tons of armed attacks on Egyptian government officials. They also carried out the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat in '81. The CIA used assets like Zawahiri to plan out actual militant and terrorist operations. That wasn't what bin Laden did. Osama was a middleman. He facilitated the transfer of money, sometimes weapons, to groups that the CIA was trying to reach. That doesn't make him innocent. I'm not saying he's a good guy. It just means that bin Laden did not play the role that our government and media likes to portray. They pinned a lot of stuff on bin Laden that he had nothing to do with, kind of like 9/11. He didn't plan that, but we'll get into that in a later video. I do want to say one last thing about bin Laden's construction work in Coast. The CIA put bin Laden in charge in the mid-1980s of building this massive, mostly underground compound nestled in the mountains of Paktia, I think it was, province, just real close to the Pakistani border. Well, after the invasion of Afghanistan, after 9/11, the enemy was using this area as a staging ground. It's called Zawar Kili al-Badr. The USA bombed the crap out of it and eventually took over the territory. And amidst this sprawling network of caves and tunnels, the military built some above-ground bases. One of them is Forward Operating Base Chapman. The CIA set up a facility inside that base to act as an intelligence command center that they used to launch all of these drone strikes all over in Pakistan. Well, the Pakistani intelligence service decided to fight back. And in 2009, the ISI paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to a terrorist network to launch an attack on this CIA facility. The network recruited this Jordanian doctor, a guy named Humam Khalil Abul-Malal, al-Balawi, something like that. He was a double agent working for the Taliban. So the doctor infiltrated the CIA facility wearing a bomb vest, and he killed 10 people, wounded a bunch of others in a suicide attack. It was the second biggest loss of CIA agents in a single day. So this is just what Ron Paul used to always say. All this meddling creates blowback, unintended consequences. The CIA poured all of this effort and money into setting up the Al-Qaeda network, building bases for them, only to have Al-Qaeda come back and spill blood in the very bases that the CIA had built for them. What goes around comes around. If you watched my series on the psychopaths of the New World Order, you might remember that one of the primary traits of a psychopath is that they're so lacking in concern and empathy for other people, these people they abuse, they don't even anticipate what those victims are going to do back to them, how they're going to respond. They either can't see or simply don't care about the long-term consequences of their own abusive actions. So in that sense, we can say with clinical accuracy that those in the CIA who are causing all this chaos are, in a literal sense, psychopaths. Okay, before I move on to Osama's activities in Sudan, I do want to touch on this topic just a bit more, specifically how the CIA was using Zawahiri, who is allegedly the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. And one last thought popped in my mind, in case I didn't mention it in the previous video. Mohammed bin Laden, Osama's father, he was the richest man in Saudi Arabia next to the Saudi royal family. And he was a multi-billionaire, and he made this money primarily through his construction business. It was worth like $7 billion, something like that. And from that, after Mohammed was killed in that plane crash, Osama inherited around $30 million. So he had some operating money there to get started. I just don't remember if I mentioned that or not. Genie Oil Investigation Part 12. I want to take a second to just briefly mention that the Bush family has a very intimate relationship with the bin Laden family. As I mentioned previously, Osama bin Laden's father, Mohammed, was the richest man in Saudi Arabia outside of the Saudi royal family. And he owned a billion-dollar corporation that today is called the Saudi bin Laden Group. In 1972, Mohammed bin Laden, he died in a plane crash on his way to marry his 23rd wife. His oldest son, Salem, he took over the family business, the corporation. It's based in the Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah. Now, President George H.W. Bush, the father of President George W. Bush, he was connected with the CIA from at least 1953, when operatives inside the agency, including a guy named Thomas Devine, helped this senior Bush to set up his first oil venture, Zapata Petroleum. We know that Bush himself was working as a secret operative for the CIA, and that he played a role in the assassination, we don't know exactly what, but some role, the assassination of JFK. We have several pieces of evidence to confirm this, including a memo that was written by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover the day after John F. Kennedy's assassination. And the memo specifically states that George Bush, from the CIA, was in Houston on the day of the assassination. There's also a picture you can see online of George H.W. Bush that was taken in Houston on the day that JFK was killed. Of course, Bush denies all this. He says that the guy in the photo is not him, and that J. Edgar Hoover must have been talking about some other George Bush because he was in Dallas on the day of the assassination, which is 3 hours away, even though he never provided any real alibi. Well, anyway, President Gerald Ford was our president in the early 70s, and then Carter took over in 76, so he was the president during the late 70s. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush served for a time as CIA director under both of those presidents, and it was during the 70s that the CIA was really ramping up their covert efforts to create the Muslim jihadist network, and Bush directed some of that effort. The CIA was using a dirty offshore bank to funnel money to their money man in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the guy we know as Osama bin Laden. The name of the bank was BCCI, or the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. The BCCI was the bank for drug trafficking and arms traffickers. So the CIA laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through BCCI to bin Laden to dole out for operations of the Afghan and Arab fighters who later came to be known as Al-Qaeda. So between 1977 to 79, the Zionist cabal took George H.W. Bush and put him to work as the director of the Council on Foreign Relations. During that time, in 1978, Bush's son, George W. Bush, started his first oil company called Arbusto. But George W. Bush is a moron, and over the company's first decade, W. had to have his friends bail it out 3 times to keep it from going bankrupt, because he just couldn't figure out how to get it going. Well, George H.W. Bush was Vice President of the United States from 80 to 88. During those years, the CIA continued to funnel money to Osama bin Laden through BCCI. BCCI was also the bank that was used by the CIA during the 80s to run guns to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and it was the same bank that was laundering money during George H.W. Bush's illegal Iran-Contra operations. So George H.W. Bush became president in 1988. It was the first campaign I ever worked on. And that same year, George Jr.'s company was still on the brink. Salam bin Laden, the older brother of Osama bin Laden and the head of the bin Laden group, he made a significant investment in George W.'s oil company and saved it from collapse. Now think about that. Osama bin Laden's brother, Salem, saved George W. Bush's company from going out of business while George W.'s father was president of the United States. George H.W. Bush was helping Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, and Osama's older brother, Salem, bailed out H.W.'s son's oil company. Does that sound suspicious to you? Does to me. And well, it's also very strange. I won't get into it. Salam bin Laden died that same year in 88 in a mysterious plane crash in the state of Texas where the Bush family lived. Very strange. So after H.W. Bush lost the election in 92, he went to work as the senior advisor for a company called the Carlyle Group. That's a company that several members of the bin Laden family had invested millions of dollars in. It's no coincidence that the chairman of the Carlyle Group was the former deputy director of the CIA, Frank Carlucci. Carlucci had served as the U.S. Secretary of Defense under Reagan while H.W. Bush was still vice president. So lots of connections here. In 1996, intelligence services that were investigating Osama bin Laden were ordered by somebody to back off their investigation and not look any further into how Osama bin Laden was being funded. All right, skip ahead 2 years. In November of 98, H.W. Bush traveled to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to meet with the bin Laden family on behalf of the Carlyle Group. And he also met with them again in January of 2000. And at first, Bush denied that this meeting took place, but then a thank you note that was exchanged between Bush and the bin Ladens after the meeting surfaced, and Bush had to retract his or correct his previous statement. So the Carlyle Group, they made a lot of money investing very heavily in the weapons industry. So when H.W.'s son, George W. Bush, launched the war in Iraq, Both George H.W. Bush and the bin Laden family made a fortune off of their investments in the military-industrial complex through the Carlyle Group. Very nasty connection. In fact, between September 10th and 11th of 2001, former President George H.W. Bush was hosting Osama bin Laden's brother Shafiq as a guest of honor in Washington, D.C. at a Carlyle Group meeting. It was at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So after the attack happened the morning of September 11th, of course, all of the flights were grounded. Nobody was allowed to fly in or out of the country. But Daddy Bush and Bush Jr. arranged for Osama bin Laden's brother Shafiq, as well as 23 other members of the bin Laden family, to fly out of the United States on a private jet back to Saudi Arabia. Tell me that doesn't stink. Despite Bush's claim that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the deaths of all of these Americans, deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history, he lets Osama bin Laden's family flee the country without even interrogating them. FBI never even talked to them to see if they had any kind of helpful information. And just a few months after saying that the United States would get bin Laden dead or alive, President George W. Bush, he publicly declared that bin Laden was irrelevant and that he wasn't even worried about finding him. And we shift from looking for bin Laden to going after Hussein. Every bit of this that I've told you is easily verifiable. You can look it all up. Bush Sr. was the CIA director while the agency was sending money to Osama bin Laden. Osama's brother Salem bailed out George W. Bush's oil company. Bush Sr. went to work after serving as president for a company that the bin Laden family had heavy investments in. And together, the Bushes and the bin Ladens made hordes of money when Bush Jr. took the United States to war against Iraq. Unbelievable. And after Osama's alleged involvement in 9/11, the Bush clan helped the bin Laden family escape interrogation. Those two families, the Bushes and bin Ladens, are the spiritual spawn of Satan. If you want to learn more about the connections between the Bush clan and the bin Laden clan and Saudi Arabia, I recommend award-winning investigative journalist Craig Unger, U-N-G-E-R. His book is called House of Bush, House of Saud. Excellent book. Very, very well documented.